Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the fourth paragraph of the third chapter of the second book of Von Clausewitz Vom Kriege. Its title being Difference. The text follows. The essential difference consists in this, that war is no activity of the will, which exerts itself upon inanimate matter like the mechanical arts, or upon a living but still passive and yielding subject, like the human mind and the human feelings in the ideal arts, but against a living and reacting force. How little the categories of arts and sciences are applicable to such an activity strikes us at once, and we can understand at the same time how that constant seeking and striving after laws like those which may be developed out of the dead material world could not but lead to constant errors. And yet, it is just the mechanical arts that some people would imitate in the art of war. The imitation of the ideal arts was quite out of the question, because these themselves dispense too much with laws and rules, and those hitherto tried, always acknowledged as insufficient and one-sided, are perpetually undermined and washed away by the current of opinions, feelings, and customs. Whether such a conflict of the living as takes place and is settled in war is subject to general laws, and whether these are capable of indicating a useful line of action, will be partly investigated in this book. But so much is evident in itself that this, like every other subject which does not surpass our powers of understanding, may be lighted up and be made more or less plain in its inner relations by an inquiring mind, and that alone is sufficient to realize the idea of a theory. This is an important paragraph in which von Clausewitz fundamentally explains why it's the case that war is not properly an art nor a science, right? Albeit, it's kind of closer to the first than the latter, and it also explains what's the fundamental difference in the first place with this other. So the difference of this all, that's the title. And the text says, the essential difference consists in this, that war is no activity of the will, which exerts itself upon inanimate matter, like the mechanical arts, or upon a living but still passive and yielding subject, like the human mind and the human feelings in the ideal arts, but against a living and reacting force. So we have seen this all before, telling the truth. Here von Clausewitz is summing up the thing. The first thing in chronological order we have seen since the beginning is that effectively war has to do in the first place with a living and reacting force, that is, the enemy, right? You're not fighting war as if this was a suspensed activity that you had essentially a pattern to follow in order to applicate against something that stays there just to get your bombs or bullets and that stuff. No. It has to do against, first of all, a living, and secondly, and most importantly, I would say, a reacting force. So the enemy doesn't sit there just to be annihilated. It's gonna strike back, and it's gonna put you, in trouble if you lower the guard, if you leave him an initiative that has naturally is always there in potential, we can say, and that is always the gap that is more likely the enemy to exploit, right, where you really don't expect it. And this is general statement, right? Another important thing that von Clausewitz tells in this paragraph is that is also, can we answer, are there certain general principles that we can express in order to outline what war is, right? To delineate more or less what it is. Well, yes, there is, but once again, it's more or less, right? And many people say, well, it's kind of lame. Well, it's just more or less. Well, it's just more or less because it's really just more or less, right? You'll never find a pattern to follow during war, just, that will grant you victory. It never happens. Like, there's not a pre-existing move that will tell you, you're gonna make it anyway, right? Or it's always a matter of probability, and how this will unfold eventually is yet to be seen, right? And never, as in war, and this is something that von Clausewitz says, but it was acknowledged actually since a long time in our history, the outcome is more distant on average from what we have expected than in any other human activity, right? But we also have explained throughout all this series why this is the case, right? It's really about the complication of the system in itself, right? It's less predictable in general, so yeah, there is a general tendency, and that's why we must talk about more or less, right? This is even when you have, I don't know, an overwhelming advantage, you're gonna win. But the question is how will is really committed in that war, how many spiritual resources, how motivated you are really at the end of the day. And therefore that can really make a big difference, because it's not just a matter of winning, but since war is just an instrument of policy that is used as its prosecution fundamentally, well, all that matters is not even war in itself, but it's what this thing has been done for in the first place, right? And what consequences it's going to have, etc. So this is also very important. We'll see it better at the end. But this is the first concept. War doesn't fit like in the perfect description of an art, right? That is here the only example that von Clausewitz makes, but definitely not a science. So we spent, the previous chapter actually to explain why this is the case and why the positivistic approach to the construction of a theory of the art of war fails miserably all the time. But it's not even an art, because you have something that is basically pushing back, and not just to simply react what you're doing, right? It's an intelligent reaction aimed at your own defeat, essentially. So it's something that goes beyond and can be framed in simply like a set of options you can list, so that you get skilled in that art, and therefore you're gonna master it, right? You're gonna master it with experience, but this is yet not the certainty that you will make it, that you will win, right? This is really the biggest problem at the end of the day. So what's the difference with these other forms of art, right? Here von Clausewitz distinguishes also between mechanical and ideal arts. So the mechanical arts are here described as essentially an activity that a will that is exerted, let's say, is exerting itself upon inanimate matter, right? So you have something dead, right? Not just passive, but basically it doesn't react, right? There is some intrinsic, physical resistance, but it has not to do with the object you're dealing with, right? So it's and on the other hand, it's that the ideal art is the will exerting itself on a living but still passive and yielding subject, like the human mind and the human feelings in the ideal arts, right? I was quoting. So what does this mean? Is that you can definitely take a look, at philosophy, at literature, at what we call art narrowly meant, right? In this world in which you are essentially contending still with someone, in the sense that you're essentially analyzing someone else's ideas, and therefore something that doesn't stay there just like a passive object, but you have basically to animate it, to animate yourself actually, and to explore and to mold, and therefore to see also in a different light. So it's really changing, right? There is no fixed standard at that point. It's just about you interacting actively with someone else's ideas, right? So even in here, it's very different, because it's still not something that is adverse to you, There is no intention in there, right? Those ideas for striking back against you actively and evolving in that sense. It's still you basically mastering them. Just like you can do mechanical arts, right? War is properly not an art ever. I mean, in its fullest, let's say better, exactly because it has to do with a living and reacting force. So when we talk about the theory of the art of war, it's important also to stress the concept of theory here, that it is essentially a set of, of ideas, right, that of relations that are essentially applicated to something we see out there that we, however, can just outline in general, and that therefore cannot be regarded as, okay, I will follow this, therefore I will make it. Because still there is room for whatever you have to do in this context that cannot be framed within a theory. And we've seen in the previous paragraphs what the theory is in this regard. I mean, the theory is something you have to, you can't even deal with as a manual, but a manual that is not to be positivistically intended to solve your problems. It's simply something you have to keep in your pouch next to you, while you're doing, where you're fighting, where you're commanding, in fact, and going back to it when, let's say, you have to revisit maybe certain concepts, certain general outlines, but then the action you will take will be based largely on some data that you will never find in that manual, then that it's not possible to write. And it turns out that the human mind is already pretty damned well suited for sorting out, basically, right? And this capacity of this talent that gets formed through certain characteristics and experience that will be better than anything that can be pre-written, right? As experience basically surpasses, especially in war and also in military history, all the theoretical speculations based on no actual evidence, right, and no continuity, and not comparison with various patterns that seem to get represented, but that can never be fixed, let's say fixed or sclerotized as it will always going like that, because theoretically really everything can happen in reality, right? So von Clausewitz goes on, it says, how little the categories of arts and sciences are applicable to such an activity strikes us at once, right? So it's really a big deal. You can't do as if, we're really approximating the concept. Objectively, this is not an art nor a science, and we have to deal with it since the start, right? You can't look away, you can't pretend this is something different, you can't pretend that approximation is just quantitative, right? That's essential. So you can't really address the issue, you can't pretend that the validity of it in reality is based on the same way arts or sciences do, right? Arts may be closer to that, as we will see now, but definitely not science, and still art in this regard makes you understand more what it is, that there is a kind of automatism, if you want, that you start to develop by sheer experience and exercise. This is very important, and it can be seen in various activities, various arts proper, for which in fact we use our mind and body responding automatically, as if there was no way to think about it. It's like tying your shoe, right? It's not that were you to explain how to do it, probably we would fail to explain it, but we already have it, it's there, we do it. So it's a bit of the same thing in war, and that's why that theoretical side of the story is overly complicated. It's a matter not of how hard your parents maybe tried to explain to you how to tie your shoe back when you were a kid, but rather how much you personally tried to get it done that ultimately has made the difference? Well, this is a fitting example because it's exactly what command is supposed to be. You can talk and talk about a lot of things, but until you don't have a direct experience, you can quite difficultly see how it's going to be. It's like learning how to drive a car, right? With all the various pedals and the gear, you get confused at the beginning, but then you simply start doing it because it works, and you're simply going with that, and you don't seem to need further theoretical confirmation on how we have to do, but just keeping on driving and an experience in that regard. And definitely that is not an assurance that it will always go well, right? That's also important. You have to learn through stages, through passages that have to take into account the difficulties of it. So this is in the sense in which von Clausewitz says such an activity strikes us at once, because it's not, you can't delay that, right? You can't say, well, okay, I will I got it, but I will understand the practical side of the story later. No, you can't really do that, right? This is finalized, and this is aimed, let's say, always to command. Here von Clausewitz is really talking about what makes the difference in a real war, right? So it's kind of interesting because, as we have often remembered, the Vom Kriege actually had a much greater success among civilians than the military men. And von Clausewitz, in fact, had conceived this book really for everybody, right? It wasn't really a military book in the sense that it was destined just to be taught in military academies, right? The concept here, though, is that the importance of the development of a theory of the art of war lays, however, also in a parallel field that is the one of military history, as we have seen many times, for which basically military history is this necessary, not really necessary, but definitely very important complement, right, that can perfection pretty well the skill of command as such. Naturally, I'm not a military commander, I can't tell you, and nor most of military historians are, but it turns out that studying military history is at least pretty good to understand what, on average, not really the outcome of wars or battles will be. At least not strictly, but it's kind of an exercise in a form of intellectual inquiry that opens your mind to the enormous set of eventualities that can take place when we will have, in theory, to command, right? This is an important concept because, indeed, not all what we study about war can be simply, and in order to make war well, right, effectively, as politicians also, and not just as military men, is in fact connected to the military exercise, right? The theory is that, well, let's not go that far yet because we will see it on other parts of the Vom Kriege, but let's say that you can't simply think of a civilization working, let's put it in this way, in which commanders self-teach themselves, in fact, on the battlefield, right? There is an experience that is cumulated and that needs to be shared that doesn't really tell you whether you will be successful or not out there, because it's really not there, but it at least will channel your resources towards a realistic assessment of what can concretely happen, and that's already a first step to do well, right? To achieve a result that is not simply based on your perception, but that fundamentally is substantiated with things that have already happened in the past, that have already left a mark, historically speaking, and then in this regard can help us to evaluate what can be done in the first place. Then this is a task of politics, I would say, right? I think that studying history has this value, has this civic importance and dimension, right? You have to understand that studying war is not just a strange niche, pastime. It's really about realizing the inherent relations that exist between politics, war, and society that constantly reflect one with the other, right? There is not a moment in civilization in which you simply say, okay, now there is no war, therefore I don't need to study what war is. Because war is intrinsic, like conflictuality, first of all, conflict in general, is present throughout all politics and society. And it can break out violently at every moment, right? So you can't lack education in an essential third of what your entire life as a human being is going to be about, right? Politics, violence, and society. So when that's the reason why you have to study war in a nutshell for von Clausewitz. And okay, he goes on and says, and we can understand at the same time how that constant seeking and striving after laws like those which may be developed out of the dead material world could not but lead to constant errors, right? This is another very important point. You don't have to think that in this regard, this social sciences, because that's essentially what politics, sociology, and warfare, and military history, you want to say better, are really about. They are social sciences. They have to do with incredibly complicated systems. I mean, this is what every physicist knows. I mean, that the most precise calculation in the range of subjects like physics, etc., are aimed at understanding the ultimate basis of our reality, right? But when you enlarge the field and you start realizing that you can maybe even know what's all the deal with space and matter and time and energy, etc., but really what is more important to you is really also where you live in, right? How big certain particles, whether it's standard in minus 28 or minus 24, to be, what is that actually changes in your life. It doesn't change anything, actually, even for the same physicists. It changes an enormous deal to try to decipherate things like politics, like society, economics, right? And that's a big deal. And the reason why we still largely fail to do it is because these systems are enormously more complicated than anything you study in a kind of a more, aseptic situation where you get really to fewer data after all, to fewer things you're gonna collect data about, right? Where do you start to collect data when you have to study a war, right? What's even just historically speaking, what's the confidence of anyone to pretend to know what actually happened in the past? Because the most obvious answer is that we don't know basically anything about nothing that happens in absolute terms by any standard in every given moment of our perception. Like, we have no certainty about the existence of anything we perceive, or that we don't even know what that even means in the first place. So what the hell can you know what happened, I don't know, even 5 seconds ago, and leaving aside, 200 years ago or 20,000. So that's where really, and this is the same point that von Clausewitz makes at the beginning of the Vom Kriege, when he says, if you're really looking at what the limits of our knowledge, you will have to say, okay, let's give up everything, because simply we can't know everything, and yet we're able to do something, right? It's as if there was a sort of set of approximations that we kind of buy into as, less approximate they are. But then at the end of the day, everything is approximate, right? Every single perception is approximate, right? Our even our physical understanding of reality is approximate. We know that there are other areas of the universe where there are physical laws that do not match with our own, and we're still trying to figure out why, and the reason being that, in fact, we haven't figured out a big deal after all, and that knowledge is still approximate. So even in history, and this is important because recently we talked a bit about things like authority, accuracy, and all this stuff in the historical field. Well, that's what you have to be open to. I mean, to the idea that, yeah, there can be better, worse realizations, let's say, but you fundamentally can't predict everything. You can't even predict a small part of what will ever happen in a certain moment, even where you're studying something that has already happened. It's not a matter of predict the future, right? It's really a matter of saying what the hell happened in that past, and it's essentially just a race between people, among people who are going to approximate more precisely, right, than others, and that's literally it. And von Clausewitz says if you won't really look at war, well, you should be able to do the same thing and realize that, yeah, there are certain general, let's call them principles, right, but those are not valid at all times. And that's why we get actually a pretty dramatic failure every time we try to predict with certainty something, right? We start from the beginning in this delusion that we are able essentially to predict, to understand everything is going to happen. You can't, because you should take into consideration literally every factor, and that's physically impossible simply for our, pretty limited, even neurological structure. It's impossible, and we have to deal with that. We deal with that ever since we were born, right? So, excuse me, I drink a little bit. So, but the problem is that this attitude brings to errors, to constant errors. Here von Clausewitz stresses, and it's pretty fair, it's pretty correct, because errors cannot be deleted, right? It can't be just a matter of saying, well, now I will then be more careful, and therefore I will avoid mistakes. No, you're simply gonna do less mistakes, but the problem, even in there, is that even your presumption of thinking that you have found out the way to obtain less mistakes is actually a mistake in itself, because it hasn't taken into consideration all what you do not know by default as a quantity of things, right? And therefore you're always going to incur in mistakes. So treating war affair, this is what he's really saying, as a science or an art, where you even, so therefore even denying the fact that you're acting against a living and reacting force, well, it's going to lead to total disaster, because it's not just a tiny mistake of approximation. It's literally having not understood anything about the first thing, the thing in the first place, and this is what we constantly do as a mistake. It's like those people who think, I don't know, that Sun Tzu is comparable to von Clausewitz, but those are people that objectively do not understand what here von Clausewitz has pointed out quite simply. So you can't compare a system, a philosophical system that was formulated in the times of Pythagoras and one at the time of Hegel, right? It doesn't work. It will not work. It's something totally different. But the reason why we still indulge in such mistakes, and why there are so many publications of people that now in 2020, well, now in this year we have something else to think about, unfortunately, will explain the new art of war, because war has really changed now, because we were playing so many different things that we didn't have in the past, and we're so slow to understand because we have drones, right? As if drones changed the essence of warfare. Warfare that never changes by any standard. War in its essence is literally the same thing at all times, and in anything what we're seeing, what happens in in contemporary history is exactly what von Clausewitz has explained, but not because he pretended to come there to teach you something like an art, right? Like this sum of sapiential wisdom knowledge that Sun Tzu had formulated quite simply, right? Remarkably for the time, but really nothing to do with what's the point here in the Vom Kriege. And well, we think that's the way, because we completely lack military in general, military culture, military education. We don't even see what the point is. We exchange von Clausewitz as a kind of wizard that tells us what to do in battle. No. And if you think like that, it's because you don't even have read the Vom Kriege. Let's be honest, don't even need to study that, just read it. And that's what we deal, unfortunately, with a lot of things, so that we do constant errors that are also massive in magnitude. And what I would like to make you understand in here is that maybe, this is not just like not knowing how to make a beverage. This is not knowing how politics and society work. Because if you don't know how war works, even if you're in peacetime, you can't understand what politics is and what society is. Inherently. Essentially. I don't know where we will get like this, because the interesting thing is that actually our military, fortunately, and partly also our politics, definitely knows what all this thing is about. I mean, von Clausewitz dominates all, military culture worldwide, right? Since, more than 1 century worldwide. So the point here is this thing is on, and most people don't even know this. So I would like to make you understand it's something big. And there are many other things, like in our world, that we don't deal with, like, you can make many examples, some of which are self-evident, that are going on right now, that we dramatically underestimate things that are of enormous importance. The reason being, we are poorly educated. It's literally it. Like, we could never avoid, of course, to get rid of problems and errors. But if just we were all more educated, certain things wouldn't happen. We would be far-seeing. We would have an objective capacity of dealing with problems in a much more responsible and effective way. So this is where it gets like even in understanding what are the limits of civilization. Civilization does have limits, unfortunately so, right? But the point here is getting the general, if you want, the popular, or even just the civic, because this is really the important thing here, especially in the countries that dominate in the world that are essentially democratic, right? Groups on population on the right track of telling them, look, here it doesn't matter what political side you take, what's your beliefs. Here you have a theory that is for some reason, that even if you don't want to acknowledge, now shared by all the military in the world and all the politics in the world, even if, of course, even in this regard, we will have to, I mean, it's taken as a base, let's say, better. Not that many people, after all, understand these things, but those who are in charge in the specific sectors do, at least, because this is mandatory stuff there. That really has this impact, and you don't know. So there is a heavy loss in not knowing this. Right, there is a great problem, a great collective problems in not realizing what this stuff is. And right now, well, we could expand even on other topics, but that's the point. We should avoid errors as much as we can, and even just analyzing the logical chain that von Clausewitz has used to point this out for war is the same one we can use for politics and society. So once again, not solving the thing immediately or fully, or even thinking that is possible, but just realizing that we can't do a big deal in order to stem substantial part of errors, right, and in their effects. Which for people is not satisfactory, because it's either everything or nothing. Like, everything that is in between seems less appealable for some reason. But that's probably another way of seeing the major problems of our society. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, and yet it is just the mechanical arts that some people would imitate in the art of war. So what he's saying here is that there is a tendency to prefer, like, the idea that, after all, this is a sort of mechanism, right? That war is fundamentally about kind of literally mechanical problem. We were talking about mechanicistic approach to war in itself, right? The idea that there are certain blocks that you can't put in the right order so that you can get the concrete picture for what it is, right? The concept that, after all, it's based about that number and that quantity and that instrument materially meant, and then you have war, right? Many people are generally approaching war in this regard, right? As if it was a mechanical problem to solve. War is nothing like that. A war is principally a moral matter. It's really about your moral resources, first of all. Then the means, the material objects come second to that, and by far, right? We've seen it in the previous paragraphs. We don't repeat it now. And here, von Clausewitz, though, reflects also on the reason why this happens. Like, why is there such a preference? Well, we've seen it in the previous, in the first, I think it was the second chapter of the second book, when he makes the list essentially of what pushed people, essentially intellectual laziness, right? To start from the principle that war is effectively about material objects, right? Because those are the only ones you can, scientifically calculate, right? But eliminating by default since the beginning, exactly because that's where the main problem, the main difficulty was recognized explicitly, right? So we actually knew it all along. It's not something we discovered later. Was the moral side of the story. And von Clausewitz says here another thing that, however, is important regarding the ideal arts, because it says the imitation of the ideal arts was quite out of the question, because these themselves dispense too much with laws and rules, and those hitherto tried always acknowledged as insufficient and one-sided, and perpetually undermined and washed away by the current of opinions, feelings, and customs. So, what he's saying here is that, objectively, yes, the abstraction, more than the, let's say, moral side of the story, was very difficult, right? So there was this idea that war was either a mechanical thing or actually an ideal thing, right? Not even a theoretical one, but something you could philosophize upon, right? The idea that it's just a matter of opinion, so you can ideally look at war in some abstract situation, but not even to think at war as how you have to wage it, but whether, for example, should be waged or not, right? And not concentrating on effectively what happens. So this second part was kind of the least useful in part, right? It really lacked too much every kind of theoretical systematization. Paradoxically, the the material approach, right, starting from the Renaissance to know how to, simple things like all the moves that a musketeer had to perform in order to remain in formation and also to load the musket and shoot it, etc. Well, that at least paved the road for realizing that that mechanical side of the story was systematized, failed. So paradoxically, from that realization, there was the acknowledgement that something extra had and vital in that regard had to be added to really build the theory of the art of war, but taking another path that objectively up to von Clausewitz had not really been tried, because that had gone towards the once again the abstraction of concepts, not looking at war how it was had been effectively fought, but simply at theorizing, saying, okay, but what if we take out this factor and this other, and therefore we can rise up to a completely pure theory that can always be applied. Well, that's a contradiction, because the more factors you can take out of it, and the less that's going to be real. So the least you're going to do concretely with war, right? So the mistake all starts from considering war as an art in this case. So not realizing that you're actually dealing with someone that is interacting with you from the other side, and having a different point of view than your own. So you don't actually dominate anything in that context. You're just dueling, as a matter of fact. And you're constantly learning, constantly making mistakes, and constantly trying to make up for them and to reach a goal. Then at that point is quite interestingly not determined on how absolutely correct you were, but also in other factors such as the same luck or probability, right? That is peculiar of the military in itself, in the Clausewitzian Trinity, by the way, because that's really what the military is about. I mean, it's this idea of risking, like really in a Russian roulette, that you know that by a certain amount there is a certain standard amount of chances you're going to fail, and it's pretty consistent one. You can't quantify it, but you know that there is a sort of plateau from which this eventually you're trying to rise constantly, and it's difficult. But the enemy can't fail as well, so you can exploit even the guy from the other side. So that's why also in the previous paragraph, von Clausewitz had compared war more like to a business competition, and even more precisely to state policy. In other words, in the latter especially, realizing that it's all about the intentions, it's all about politics, and what naturally these intentions are influenced by in the first place, so that war in itself reverts back to policy where it belongs as an instrument, and it has nothing in itself that can be seen as the root of what it works, because it's simply animated by other entities. But the idea of the business competition is important, because at that point it's not a matter of who let's say was necessarily better or worse, right, or right or wrong, but simply who emerges from there alive, right, or not necessarily alive. I mean, this is still an option in which you don't have necessarily to slaughter the enemy in the first place, right? If that was the case, every war would end up with a total annihilation of any competitor that lost, right? It's not the case, and that's why, because the military instrument is in fact an instrument. War is mitigated by politics in every single damn time, right? All things we have seen. Alright, and then von Clausewitz writes, whether such a conflict of the living as takes place and is settled in war, is subject to general laws, and whether these are capable of indicating a useful line of action will be partly investigated in this book. Right, so the point here of the question is that we arrived finally after literally almost 1/3 of the book, of the work, as it has several books in itself, is there something that can more or less make us understand what war functions like? Right? Are certain general interaction, at least the most important ones, that can be identified, certain relations, certain laws, right? Is there anything that we can square out of this, right, in a practical sense? Well, yes, there is, always, given that it's always more or less. That means that it's subordinated to other factors that are not even strictly military in the first place, right? That's really the first thing ever. Realizing that war in itself has no soul proper. It's people who do it. It's the description of an activity. It's a political act. Always remember this. War is nothing else but exclusively a political act. Right? It's actually all very simple. Von Clausewitz is very simple. It's not complicated. What he says is very, very clear. The point is realizing that it's a complex system, but that there are, after all, a few concepts that really start from the essential here, and that are remembered, in fact, rightfully also as the most important phrases, just like the war is a continuation of policy by other means, right? But there is also something that happens on the field that is intelligible, right? Not necessarily predictable, not necessarily quantifiable dimensionally, or that we can always do something about that. I mean, theoretically we can always do something about it. The point is that it's not really going to be enough most of the times, the overwhelming majority of the times, right? And there is also a realization that this thing changes continuously, and that even this negative knowledge is actually a positive one in its recognition, right? Because it really sets you on a ground that makes you deal, morally speaking, with the acknowledgement that that's how it really is. You know, how many countries, populations have been generations, individuals have been deluded propagandistically with the idea that, after all, a war is easy to win, that we're going to make it anyway, we'll pull it off anyway, right? Because we are special, because, I don't know, we belong to this country, we are under this flag, or we are under this political ideology, and then maybe all those people were literally exterminated. Well, yeah, that's the point. Already realizing that the first cause of a military defeat is politics, right? Is that everything is wired to it in the first place. That you understand the point. I don't think you have to explain myself further. But this is what von Clausewitz is telling us. Look, I can't tell you how generally this works. And the only way you can see that is realizing that this is nothing like you can conceive, right? Otherwise. But first of all, because war has very particular conditions in itself, right? It's not that war is necessarily the most complicated thing that exists, right? The world is definitely more complicated than war. But the problem with war is that you're under certain specific circumstances in which you're dramatically pressured, where a lot of things are happening that are very, very fast and very, very dangerous. And therefore you have a desperate need of positive information, positive knowledge, that in other times in history you don't see that, right? In that in other situations you don't see how dramatic they are, right? People don't get rarely, societies rarely encounter anything so devastating as war, which can technically happen, right? But look at coronavirus in here, for example. This thing, as devastating as it is, and it will create enormous problems, this thing will change. I mean, we should start freaking seriously out about what rather than the disease in itself. It is already pretty scary, but what the world will be after that, because this thing is going to change the world politics and society we're used to see, right? Not by a radical margin, but definitely in ways that, if we're freaking out just because, I don't know, the United States launched some tomahawks on some Syrian base. There's a lot of people hysterical about it, but that's actually pretty or normal business. There's really nothing to freak out in the first place. Where if you think about the changes and the devastations that this thing will bring, well, let's meet hell, it's not gonna be easy, right? And yet, for example, we don't seem to have acknowledged this, right? We don't seem to have acknowledged it in the terms in which we are reacting to it and thinking forward, like what this is gonna be. We should be capitalizing on our knowledge as long as we have the resources to think of what will happen afterwards, right? This is not happening because, after all, this thing is very gradual. In war, this is different, right? Because the moment in which you're under a shelling, you really are not here just wondering whether it will go well for you or not. I mean, you have to take shelter because otherwise you're gonna blow up. And that's a kind of pressure you don't find in other situations. Not even now, when we're in actually deep trouble, we seem to be that pressured. So it's literally even a physical thing. It's really about, kind of pressure or a certain amount of time that does make the difference. So that's why war is so messed up. That's why we have this enormous difficulty. It is definitely incapability of really getting to something closer to positive when trying to make sense of what will happen and what's going on at the same moment. Because we are under a terrible amount of pressure. This is very, very important. And Clausewitz goes on, by the way, and says, but so much is evident in itself that this, like every other subject which does not surpass our powers of understanding, may be lighted up and be made more or less plain in its inner relations by an inquiring mind, and that alone is sufficient to realize the idea of a theory. How to explain this properly? So, our intelligence, let's say, is able to make us understand the intimate relations that move within war, even if we don't quantify it properly, right? And this is enough to build up the base of a theory, right? Which doesn't mean, again, that this basis or the theory in itself is going to actually solve the system, but still we have something, a pattern to operate with, right? It's like a projection, like something you can do by approximation that changes. I mean, when you're going to when you're confronting it with reality, but at least it's not really something completely extraneous to it, right? So that you can take care of other aspects, maybe by themselves or overwhelming for you, because you're not going to stop them from happening and having even deteriorate consequences towards you. But the problem here is that we must start from something if we really want to make a positive action, because we do live making positive actions, right? It's not a matter of saying, okay, since we can't understand most of it, let's simply give it up. No, this is not how we are designed. There is always something we can't understand from it. There's always an approximation that makes sense, that helped us to go on, right? So this is the base on which von Clausewitz is building his theory. Whether now we will see how this unfolds, in the sense that there is a specific method. There is always an amount of criticism that the same theorist is called to exercise. I mean, you can't. Once again, this thing is not how reality is. It's kind of more or less of how that reality is. You can't read a book and pretend you're knowing how it's done, because you're not even started with that, right? And it's all very, it may seem confusing at the beginning. It may seem like, oh well, but I have doubts whether this is actually correct or not. But believe me, it does work. It does make sensible difference to start from these bases, right? And then whether this is going to be satisfactory or not doesn't depend on you exclusively, but still you can make a lot of difference, and still, for your own good, right? And in some certain cases it can be enough to win, right? So yeah, this is pretty much it. And in fact, this is the end of the third. Oh, actually, this was the third chapter. Of course, this is the end of the third chapter. We pass at the fourth one, that is about methodicism, and we will see better where the thing gets a bit more into the concreteness, right? And especially, I think next time there's a pretty long. This is one chapter in one video. I don't know whether we will be able to do it. In the past, we've split partly the thing because it's objectively long, but we can try to do it. We'll see. But just for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.